Okay, so let's get started creating some 3D objects in Adobe Illustrator. And to do that, we went over the panels in the previous video, but we also want to set up our document in a way that also helps us do some precise sketching for 3D. So I'm going to just create a new document. So Command N or File New will get me the new document panel. And what I like to do, because I 3D print on my CR10, which has a build plate of 300 by 300, I like to make the size of my document, definitely make it in millimeters. Beyond that, the size of it doesn't really matter because Illustrator, the size is the artboard, and you can draw beyond the artboard all you want, and that's fine. It's great. But I do like to set my width and height to the size of my 3D printer build plate because then I get a really good, reference of what the scale of my things are. Even though I can look at millimeters and sort of understand, well, hey, it's going to be about this big. Really having that reference because I'm so familiar with my printer, as you might be if you have a printer. You set it to that, and then you'll really put things in perspective as far as how big they are. So we'll go with 300 by 300. And we'll say okay. Okay, and so I get my document, and then we can do some other things to also set us up for success here. So I'm going to turn on my rulers, and so I think you can go to View and then Rulers if you want. Show Rulers. Command R is the shortcut. Or here in the Properties panel, we can click to show rulers, toggle it on and off. So that's nice because now you've got a really good understanding of sort of your millimeters across the page because our document is set up in millimeters. I also want to turn on my grid. Now your grid might not look like mine when you turn it on, and that's because you'll have the default settings. We can change those. So Control K or Command K is going to bring up your settings for Illustrator, your preferences. And what I want you to do is go to Guides and Grid, and this is a place that you want to get really comfortable with because it's actually really useful to not only set this once in a way that's good for 3D design, but it's also good to come back to and change as your needs change. And so here under the grid definition, you can specify how often you want a grid line to show up. So if you're working with really big objects that you're 3D designing, you might just want a grid line every 1 millimeter, and you don't want any subdivisions, meaning there's not going to be any smaller sort of grid lines paced out. So you can just say subdivisions 1, and that's just going to give you a grid line every millimeter. And with snap to grid turned on, which we do that if we go to the direct select tool. V is sort of like your home base. So pressing V, going to your direct select tool, clicking on the document somewhere, making sure nothing is highlighted, you're going to get your properties panel to come back and look like this. So turning on snap to grid here, if I were to now press M and draw a box, you can see I can only draw in 1 millimeter increments. And so this is really nice for that precision piece, because if I don't have this turned on, I'm drawing and I'm, drawing in hundreds of millimeters as I'm dragging this out, and it's not going to be very precise. Now we can go back to that grid definition, and we can, maybe you're not dealing with really big parts, you're actually dealing with, smaller increments of millimeters, which is probably more common for 3D printing. Maybe you want every 0.5 millimeters or every 0.25 millimeters or every 0.1 millimeter, which is a really nice, round, granular way to look at things. And so I can change the subdivisions from 1 to 10. And now sort of the darker lines you see here between them, that's 1 millimeter. But within that, if I were to zoom in, so I'm holding Option or Alt and I'm using my scroll wheel to zoom in, you can see that there are 10 subdivisions. And if I were to grab my rectangle tool again, I've still got snap to grid turned on. You can see I can't go any smaller than 0.1, but I can draw in 0.1 increments. And so this is really nice. So if I want something that is, 0.5 by 0.7 or 0.8, we can see, you know, exactly that. And I'm looking over on the right, you check over on the info panel. So on the info panel, you can see the size that you're dragging out. So you see how the width and the height is changing as I drag around. You can actually just look to that to be the size you want. Now there's a whole nother way to do this. If we take our rectangle tool or any shape tool and we just click once, so instead of dragging, we click once, we get this window which actually gives us the ability to create a very specific sized shape. So I could say, you know, I want it 2.5 by 1.2 and say okay. And now I've got that nice shape. And the next time I click, it'll actually remember what I wanted, and it will allow me to create another. Okay, so that's just some basic shape building, just using the rectangle tool. And really just setting up your grid in a way that works for you. So again, if you wanted like 0.25 increments, so like 1/4 millimeter increments, we can go back to that grid definition. We can change this to subdivisions 4, right? And we can zoom in here, and again, every time I go to one of these smaller squares, it's going to only increment by 0.25. So we have a lot of ability to control the precision with which we're drawing. I'm just going to go ahead and set this back. I like the 1 millimeter grid line every 1 millimeter with 10 subdivisions because, you know, sometimes you do need to work at that 0.1 millimeter level, but I would say most of the time, if you're really dealing with 3D printing tolerances, you don't often need to go less than that. But of course you can if you wanted to. And again, we can turn on snapping as we see fit. And so I think now our document is really well set up for us to start exploring some of the tools and methods in which we can create shapes.